The countdown on the display read 0, and every delegate in the Grand Conclave chamber fell silent. I stood behind a podium made of something that was not glass and not crystal, but felt cold under my fingers like both. My name is Daniel Ward, and I was 31 years old, the day 4,000 alien civilizations told humanity it was not welcome in the galaxy. The chamber was enormous. It stretched upward into a dome so high the ceiling vanished into soft blue light, and every curved wall was lined with seating platforms that floated without any visible support. Each platform held a delegation from a different species. I could not count them all. I had tried during my first week aboard the station and gave up somewhere past 300, because the upper tiers were shrouded in atmospheric bubbles meant for species that did not breathe oxygen. The station was called HFY, and it served as the political center of the Galactic Concordance, a parliament of 4,412 spacefaring civilizations that had governed known space for longer than human civilization had existed. We had spent 40 years applying for membership, 40 years of paperwork, cultural reviews, technology audits, biological assessments, diplomatic negotiations, and formal hearings that stretched across generations of human diplomats. I was only the latest. I was supposed to be the last. My final speech had been good. I knew it was good, because I had practiced it 200 times, and because the translation matrix had rendered it perfectly into 16,000 linguistic formats simultaneously. I had talked about cooperation, about shared discovery, about the value of fresh perspectives in an ancient galaxy. I had not begged. My instructions from Earth were clear on that point. Present our case with dignity, and let the vote speak. The vote spoke. The numbers appeared on the central display in a script I had learned to read during my first year in the diplomatic corps. 4,006 against, 342 in favor, 64 abstentions. The rejection was not close. It was not a narrow defeat that might be overturned on appeal. It was a wall. I felt my hands go numb on the podium. Somewhere behind me, I heard Lucy Grant, my deputy, exhale through her teeth in a sound that was almost a whistle. The rest of our delegation, 9 diplomats who had collectively spent over a century working toward this moment, said nothing at all. The speaker of the conclave was a drone from the Shun collective, a hive mind species that communicated through mathematical harmonics. The drone was small, about the size of a human child, with a smooth gray carapace, and 4 arms that moved in constant geometric patterns as it spoke. Its voice came through the translation matrix as something flat and precise, stripped of all emotion. The application of the Terran species, designation Sol 3, is formally denied by majority decision of the Grand Conclave. The grounds for denial are as follows: biological instability, cultural incoherence, technological prematurity, diplomatic volatility. The Terran delegation is thanked for its participation and is granted standard departure privileges. This matter is closed. Each charge landed like a stone dropped into still water. Biological instability meant they considered our species physically unreliable, too prone to mutation, too dependent on a narrow range of environmental conditions. Cultural incoherence meant they saw our thousands of languages, religions, and political systems as evidence of a species that could not agree with itself. Technological prematurity meant our science was too young, too rough, too unproven by galactic standards. Diplomatic volatility meant they did not trust us to behave. I stood at the podium for 3 seconds longer than I needed to. I did this because I wanted to look at them. I wanted to see the chamber clearly, to memorize the faces of the species that had just decided humanity was not good enough. The Velthrani delegation sat in the front tier, their elongated insectoid bodies perfectly still, their compound eyes reflecting the chamber lights in patterns of amber and green. They were the oldest species in the Concordance, and they had led the opposition to our membership for all 40 years. Their representative, a matriarch whose name I could not pronounce, watched me with an expression I had learned to recognize as satisfaction. The Dravine, massive silicon-based beings who towered over every other species in the chamber, had already turned away. They had never been interested in us at all. We were carbon-based life, and the Dravine regarded carbon life as temporary, a phase the universe would eventually outgrow. I stepped away from the podium. I did not thank the chamber. The protocol manual said I should deliver a formal acknowledgement and express gratitude for the opportunity to present our case. I decided the protocol manual could wait. I walked back to my delegation, and we left the chamber together without looking back. The corridor outside was wide and curved gently to the left, following the station's ring structure. The walls hummed with a low vibration that I had been told was the station's power grid, but that always sounded to me like a very large animal breathing. Lucy fell into step beside me. Her face was controlled, professional, but I could see the tension in her jaw. "That was worse than the projections," she said. The projections were optimistic. The projections were based on the assumption that at least half the neutral blocks would swing our way. They did not. No. We walked in silence for 30 seconds. Behind us, the rest of the delegation followed in a loose group. Nobody spoke. Somewhere further down the corridor, I could hear the clicking footsteps of a Velthrani diplomat and the low harmonic hum that served as polite applause among their species. They were celebrating. Quietly, formally, but celebrating all the same. We reached the Terran delegation quarters, a modest suite of rooms that the Concordants had assigned us for the duration of our stay. The rooms were functional but clearly designed for species that were not human. The furniture was slightly too tall, the lighting slightly too blue, and the humidity slightly too low. We had spent weeks adjusting it with portable equipment shipped from Earth, and it still felt like staying in someone else's house, which was exactly what it was. I closed the door and turned to face my team. 9 faces looked back at me. These were career diplomats, people who had spent their entire professional lives working toward galactic membership. Some of them had children who had grown up hearing about this day. Simon Blake, our technology liaison, looked like he had been punched. Peter Holt, the senior cultural attaché, sat down very slowly and stared at the floor. Sophie Watts, who had handled our biological compliance documentation, was already quietly gathering her files into a case. "I need a minute," I said, and walked into the private office at the back of the suite. The office had a single window that looked out into space. Aethys Yun orbited a binary star system, and the light came in 2 colors, pale gold and deep orange, that shifted across the walls as the station rotated. I sat in the chair that was too tall for me, and opened my communication terminal. There was one message waiting. It was from Earth, from Secretary General Catherine Moore herself. The transmission had been sent before the vote results were officially broadcast, which meant someone in our intelligence network had relayed the numbers the moment they appeared. The message was 5 words long. Understood. Bring everyone home. I read it twice. Then I read it a 3rd time. There was no anger in those words, no demand for an appeal, no instructions to file a formal protest, no political strategy for next steps. Just a calm acknowledgement and a clear directive. Come home. We have things to do. I sat with those 5 words for a long time. Then I opened the door and told my team, "Pack everything. We leave in 6 hours." Lucy frowned. "We have 72 hours of departure privileges. We could use that time to make informal contacts, feel out which delegations might support a future reapplication." "There will not be a reapplication." The room went very quiet. "Catherine's orders," I said. "We are going home." I expected arguments. I expected at least some of them to push back, to insist that decades of work deserved more than a 5-word retreat. But something shifted in the room when I said those words. I watched it happen. The grief that had been sitting on their shoulders like physical weight seemed to change shape, to condense into something smaller and harder and more portable. Sophie closed her file case with a click. Simon stood up and began disconnecting our portable environmental equipment. Peter nodded once, slowly, and reached for his coat. We packed in 4 hours, not 6. We were efficient about it. 30 years of accumulated diplomatic materials, cultural exchange samples, translation archives, contact databases, and personal belongings went into standardized shipping containers that were loaded onto our shuttle by a maintenance crew that watched us with open curiosity. Word had spread through the station. The humans had been rejected, and now the humans were leaving, and they were doing it without any apparent distress. I noticed the watchers. Diplomats from dozens of species lingered in the corridors near our quarters, pretending to be occupied with other business. They were waiting for the scene. Every major rejection in Concordance history had produced one. Species that were denied membership traditionally protested, appealed, bargained, threatened, or collapsed into public grief. Some had even refused to leave the station, forcing security interventions that became cautionary tales repeated across the galaxy. The Watchers expected something from us. They expected humans to behave the way rejected species always behaved. We gave them nothing. We walked to the docking port in a calm, orderly line, carrying our personal bags and speaking quietly among ourselves about logistics. Lucy was confirming our flight path with traffic control. Simon was talking to Sophie about which equipment to stow and which to keep accessible. Peter had found a packet of dried fruit in his bag and was eating it as he walked. It was the most ordinary departure in the history of galactic diplomacy, and I could feel the confusion radiating from every alien who watched us pass. At the docking port, I stopped. I do not know why I stopped. Something made me turn around and look back down the corridor toward the heart of the station. The curved walls hummed. The twin-colored light shifted across the floor. Somewhere deep inside HFY, 4,000 species were already moving on to the next agenda item, filing our rejection as a minor administrative note in a history that stretched back millennia. A hand touched my arm. I turned and found myself facing a delegate I recognized. She was Kethari, a species of tall, slender beings with dark skin that shimmered like oil on water, and large eyes that held patterns of silver light. The Kethari had voted in our favor. All of them. Their entire delegation had supported Earth's membership bid, quietly and consistently, for decades. This particular delegate, whose name was Sarah, had been one of our few genuine allies on the station. She pressed something into my hand, a small data chip, no larger than a coin, warm from her fingers. "For when you are ready," she said. Her voice through the translation matrix was gentle and slightly sad. "What is it?" "A map," she smiled. And a Kethari smile was a subtle thing, a slight widening of the eyes, a shift in the silver patterns. They never looked there. "You will." Before I could ask anything else, she stepped back and disappeared into the corridor traffic. I looked at the chip in my palm, then slipped it into my pocket. I boarded the shuttle. The door sealed behind me. Through the viewport, I watched HFY shrink from a structure into a shape, from a shape into a point, from a point into nothing. The stars did not change. They never do. I sat in my seat and thought about what had just happened. The galaxy had looked at humanity and decided we were not enough. Not stable enough. Not old enough. Not uniform enough. Not safe enough. We had been measured against a standard we did not set, and found wanting by judges we did not choose. And Earth's response had been 5 words. Understood. Bring everyone home. Not understood. And here is our plan for revenge. Not understood. And begin the appeal process. Just come home. Because home was where the work was. Home was where the future was. Home was where 7 billion people were waiting to find out what came next. And not a single one of them was going to spend that future waiting for permission from a parliament of species that had already made up their minds. They wanted us to beg. That was the part they had been looking forward to. The protocols, the precedents, the entire cultural framework of the concordance was built around the assumption that rejected species would be devastated, because membership was supposed to be the only path to relevance in the galaxy. Without the concordance, a species had no access to the lane travel network, no seat in the trade agreements, no protection under the collective defense treaties, no voice in the decisions that shaped interstellar civilization. Rejection was supposed to be a death sentence for ambition. We robbed them of their moment. We did not do it on purpose. We did not have a strategy for dignified departure. We just had better things to do. The shuttle jumped to faster than light on a trajectory that our own crude drive systems could barely maintain, and I watched the stars stretch into lines, and thought about Sarah's data chip in my pocket, and I thought about Catherine Moore's 5 words, and I thought about the look on the Velthrani matriarch's face when I walked away without thanking the chamber. I was smiling. I did not even realize I was smiling until Lucy pointed it out. "What could you possibly be smiling about?" she asked. I thought about it for a moment. "I think I am relieved," I said. "We spent 40 years trying to convince them we belonged. Now we do not have to convince anyone of anything. We just have to be ourselves." Lucy looked at me for a long time. Then she leaned back in her seat and closed her eyes, and I could have sworn I saw the corner of her mouth turn upward too. Earth looked the same from orbit. That was the first thing that struck me when our shuttle dropped out of faster than light, and the planet appeared in the viewport, blue and white, and impossibly bright against the black. I had been away for 3 years. 3 years of living on an alien station, breathing recycled air that never quite smelled right, sleeping in rooms designed for bodies shaped differently from mine. And there it was, unchanged, spinning slowly, covered in clouds that did not care about galactic politics. We landed at the Nairobi spaceport, which was the largest facility Earth had for receiving interstellar-capable vessels, though by concordance standards it would have been considered a rural landing pad. Catherine Moore was not there to meet us. She had sent a deputy, a quiet man named Edward Collins, who shook our hands and told us to get some rest and to report to the new agency in 72 hours. When I asked what new agency, he just said I would be briefed and handed me an address. The address led me to a building in Geneva that had no sign on the door. It was an old building, 6 stories of gray stone that looked like it might have been a bank or a government ministry sometime in the previous century. Inside, it was anything but old. The corridors were lined with equipment I did not recognize, and the people moving through them walked with the kind of focused energy that told me something important was happening, and everyone knew it except me. I was taken to the 4th floor and shown into an office where a woman was standing at a window, looking out at the city with a tablet in one hand and a cup of tea in the other. She turned when I entered, and I recognized her immediately. Helen Cross, former director of the European Particle Physics Consortium, winner of the Nakamura Prize for Theoretical Physics at age 34, and according to the briefing packet that Edward Collins had given me on the way from the spaceport, the newly appointed director of something called the Threshold Initiative. "You are Daniel Ward," she said. It was not a question. "I am." "Sit down. I need to explain something, and I would rather do it quickly because I have 11 other briefings today and a conference call with Buenos Aires in 40 minutes. I sat. Helen Cross did not sit. She paced. "The concordance rejected us," she said. "Fine. We expected it. Not the margin. I will admit, that margin was worse than our models predicted. But the rejection itself was always the most likely outcome, and Catherine's contingency planning for this scenario began 6 years ago. Threshold is the contingency." She put her tablet on the desk and a projection appeared above it, rotating slowly. It was a diagram I did not fully understand, but I could recognize enough of it to see that it was an engineering schematic of something vast and complex. "The premise is simple," Helen said. "Everything the concordance refused to share with us, we build ourselves. Every technology we were supposed to receive upon membership, every system we were supposed to gain access to, every advantage we were told we could not have without their approval. We build it. We build it differently, and we build it better." "Better?" I said. "Their technology is thousands of years ahead of ours." "Their technology is thousands of years old," Helen corrected. "That is not the same thing. The concordance is built on scientific frameworks established by the founding species during the first galactic expansion. Every civilization that joined after them adopted those frameworks wholesale because the founding species said, these are the correct ways to manipulate physics, and nobody ever questioned it. The Velthrani power grid runs on the same principles it ran on 8,000 years ago. The lane travel network has not been fundamentally redesigned since it was built. Their communication system, their energy generation, their material science, all of it is refined, polished, optimized, but none of it is new. They perfected their answers to the universe's questions 10 millennia ago, and then they stopped asking new ones." She paused and looked at me very directly. "We have no old answers," she said. "We have nothing but new questions. That is our advantage." The world reacted to the rejection in a way that I would not have predicted. I had braced for fury. I expected nationalist movements to seize on the insult, expected protests outside government buildings, expected angry editorials and demands for retribution. I expected the kind of wounded pride that turns inward and becomes something toxic. What happened instead was stranger and, in retrospect, more revealing about who we are as a species. People shrugged, then they laughed. Within a week of the official announcement, the rejection had become the biggest source of comedy on every social media platform on the planet. Late-night comedians built entire routines around it. University students started wearing shirts that said, "Rejected by the Galaxy," as a badge of ironic pride. A music producer in Tokyo released an album called Biologically Unstable that became the most downloaded album of the year. An artist in Lagos painted a mural of the Velthrani matriarch with a speech bubble that said, "You are not culturally coherent," next to a human shrugging with a speech bubble that said, "Have you met us?" The humor was sharp and sometimes savage, but it was not bitter. It was the laughter of a species that had survived ice ages, plagues, world conflicts, and the invention of social media, and that had developed a deep, instinctive understanding that the best response to an insult is to turn it into a joke that you tell better than the person who insulted you. But underneath the humor, something much more serious was happening. Governments that had not cooperated in generations were opening communication channels. Research institutions that had guarded their data jealously were merging their databases. Military organizations were sharing technological specifications. The rejection had done something that no treaty, no summit, no crisis had managed to do. It had given humanity a common purpose that transcended every internal division. I was briefed into the deepest levels of threshold, and what I found there changed my understanding of what humanity was capable of when it stopped trying to impress someone else and started trying to impress itself. The Concordance controlled interstellar travel through something called the Lane Network, a vast web of pre-mapped hyperspace corridors that connected every major star system in known space. The lanes were stable, reliable, and fast. They were also controlled exclusively by the Velthrani, who had built them and who charged every other species access fees that functioned as a tax on movement itself. Without Concordance membership, Earth had no access to the lanes. Our existing faster-than-light drives were crude, slow, energy-intensive things that could manage short hops between nearby stars, but nothing approaching the range and speed of lane travel. In Buenos Aires, a team of engineers and physicists had been working on something different for nearly a decade. They called it the fold-step drive. The concept was radical enough that I initially assumed it was theoretical, but Helen assured me they were already building prototypes. Instead of traveling through hyperspace corridors, the fold-step drive would fold the fabric of normal space itself, bringing the destination to the ship, rather than pushing the ship to the destination. It did not need lanes. It did not need corridors. It could go anywhere, to any point in space, by folding the distance between origin and destination down to nothing, and stepping across. The lead engineer was a young man named Simon Blake, who I had known briefly during my time at the academy, before my career took me into diplomacy, and his took him into physics. He was thinner than I remembered, with dark circles under his eyes, and a habit of talking with his hands that made him look like he was conducting an invisible orchestra. The Lane Network is a road, Simon explained during my first visit to the Buenos Aires lab. A very good road, very smooth, very fast, but still a road. You can only go where the road goes. If you want to reach somewhere the road does not connect to, you are stuck. Our drive is not a road. It is more like folding a piece of paper so that 2 points that are far apart on the surface touch each other, and then you just step from one to the other. And this works? Simon grinned. We jumped a probe 4 light-years last Tuesday. It arrived where it was supposed to arrive, in one piece, in less than a second. The Concordance's lanes cover the same distance in about 3 hours. I stared at him. You are telling me we have already surpassed their travel technology. In range and speed, yes. In reliability and safety, not yet. We have some issues with spatial distortion at the arrival point that need solving. But we will solve them. Give me a year. The fold-step drive was not the only project. In Lagos and Seoul, a collective of programmers, artificial intelligence researchers, and communications engineers were building what they called the Damon Network. The Concordance's communication system, the resonance grid, was a galaxy-spanning network that transmitted information instantaneously across any distance using quantum resonance nodes placed in every member system. Earth had never been given access to the grid. The Damon Network was a completely independent alternative, a decentralized mesh of quantum relay satellites that used different physics, different architecture, and different principles of encryption. It was not as fast as the grid, not yet, but it was open, free, and could not be controlled or shut down by any single authority. In Reykjavik, a bioengineering laboratory was growing ships. Not building them, growing them. The Concordance's vessels were constructed from advanced alloys and composite materials in orbital shipyards, and they were impressive machines, sleek and powerful and precise. The Reykjavik team was taking a completely different approach. They were cultivating organic hull material from engineered biological compounds that could self-repair, adapt to environmental conditions, and integrate with onboard computing systems at a cellular level. The ships they were producing looked nothing like anything in the Concordance fleet. They were darker, more textured, covered in patterns that resembled the veining of a leaf or the branching of a nervous system. They were alive, in a meaningful sense, and they were beautiful in a way that made something in my chest tighten every time I saw them. I visited every major threshold facility over the course of 2 months. I saw quantum computing arrays that processed information using principles the concordance had never explored. I saw energy research that drew power from spatial anomalies rather than stellar fusion. I saw material science laboratories where engineers created substances that did not exist in any concordance database. And everywhere I went, I saw the same thing in the eyes of the people doing the work. Not anger, not desperation, not a desire for revenge, something else entirely. Something that looked like joy. They were free. For the first time in 40 years, human scientists and engineers were not trying to build things that met concordance specifications. They were not trying to pass technology audits designed by alien committees. They were not trying to prove that their work was compatible with galactic standards set by species that had stopped innovating before humans learned to write. They were building whatever they wanted, however they wanted, for no reason other than that they could. I remember standing in the Buenos Aires lab, watching Simon work through a spatial geometry problem on a transparent display. He had been at it for hours. The problem was one that concordance physicists had spent 11 centuries calling impossible, a particular configuration of folded space that their mathematical models said could not be stabilized. Simon was attacking it with an approach that no concordance physicist would have considered, because it drew on a branch of mathematics that had been developed on Earth in the 21st century and had no equivalent in galactic academia. He solved it at 3 in the morning. He solved it with a diagram drawn on a napkin, a cold cup of coffee, and an analogy borrowed from origami. He held up the napkin and showed me, and I understood approximately 10% of what I was looking at, but I understood enough to know that it was something the galaxy had never seen before. That was the moment I understood what the concordance had really done when they rejected us. They did not reject us because we were primitive. Our technology was young, yes, but it was not primitive. They rejected us because we were unpredictable. Every species in the concordance had followed the same scientific path, adopted the same frameworks, reached the same conclusions through the same methods. They were a galaxy of civilizations that agreed on the fundamental rules of how things worked, and that agreement was the foundation of their order. Humanity did not agree. Humanity had never agreed. We had 1,000 different approaches to every problem, 100 different mathematical traditions, dozens of competing physical theories, and a cultural tolerance for chaos that no other species in the galaxy possessed. We were not too primitive for the concordance. We were too creative. And creativity, in a galaxy that had not had a genuinely new idea in 10,000 years, was the most dangerous thing imaginable. That night, back at my quarters, I remembered Sarah's data chip. I had been carrying it in my pocket for months, touching it occasionally without thinking about it, the way you touch a lucky coin. I pulled it out and inserted it into a secure terminal. The chip contained a star chart, not a chart of concordance space, which was extensively mapped and cataloged and available in any public database. This was a chart of a region that did not appear in any public database at all. A vast stretch of the galaxy, spanning thousands of light years, that the concordance had designated the Void March. Restricted space. Off limits. The chart was detailed and precise. Clearly the product of long-range observation rather than direct exploration. The concordance had looked at the Void March from a distance, but had never gone inside. There was a single annotation at the bottom of the chart, written in Kethari script that my translation software handled without difficulty. It said, "They never looked here. You will." I stared at that annotation for a very long time. Then I picked up my communicator and called Helen Cross. "I have something you need to see," I said. 3 years after the rejection vote, I stood on the bridge of the Terran fleet ship Perseverance and watched the stars rearrange themselves. The fold step jump was nothing like lane travel. I had experienced lane travel once, during our initial journey to Shun, and it had been smooth, almost boring. The ship entered a corridor of folded hyperspace and glided along it like a train on a track, and 5 hours later you arrived at your destination, with nothing more dramatic than a slight change in the color of the light through the viewports. The fold step was different. The fold step took the space in front of you and compressed it, folded it like cloth, brought a point that was 1,000 light years away so close that you could almost touch it, and then the drive stepped the ship across the fold in a single instant. The stars did not streak or blur, they simply changed. One moment you were looking at one arrangement of lights, and the next moment, you were looking at a completely different arrangement, and your inner ear told you that something profound had happened, even though your body had not moved at all. 12 ships made the jump together. 12 ships that had been grown in Earth's orbital yards over the preceding 18 months, each one a product of the Reykjavik bioengineering program and the Buenos Aires Drive project working in concert. They were the most advanced vessels humanity had ever produced, and they looked nothing like any ship the galaxy had seen before. Their hulls were dark, living material that pulsed with faint bioluminescent patterns, blues and greens and occasional flickers of amber that traced the vascular networks running beneath the surface. They had no sharp edges. They curved and flowed like something that had evolved, rather than been designed, and in a real sense they had. Each ship was partially alive, its hull capable of self-repair, its internal atmosphere maintained by symbiotic biological systems that recycled air and water, with an efficiency no mechanical system could match. The organic computing cores woven into their structures processed information differently from conventional computers, using patterns modeled on neural architecture rather than binary logic. The Perseverance was the flagship, and I was aboard it not as commander but as diplomatic coordinator, because Helen Cross had argued persuasively to Catherine Moore that whatever we found in the Void March, we would need someone who understood first contact protocols. The actual captain was a woman named Grace Elliott, a former naval officer who had transferred into the newly formed Terran Frontier Command when it became clear that Earth's future lay in exploration rather than application forms. Grace was calm in the way that certain military professionals are calm, not because she lacked emotions but because she had trained herself to process them in a separate compartment that did not interfere with her decision-making. She stood at the center of the bridge, which was not really a bridge in any traditional sense, but rather a curved space woven with organic display surfaces that showed sensor data, navigation plots, and external views simultaneously. The data flowed across the surfaces like water moving over stones, constantly updating, constantly shifting. It was like standing inside a living diagram. "Fold step complete," reported Nathan Ellis, the navigation officer from his station. "All 12 ships have arrived. Formation intact. Drive systems nominal." Grace nodded. "Position?" "We are at the outer boundary of the Void March, approximately 400 light-years from the nearest concordance border marker. No lane corridors within sensor range. No resonance grid nodes detected." "We are off the map," Grace said, and there was something in her voice that was not quite excitement, and not quite reverence, but lived somewhere between the two. The Void March unfolded before us on the display surfaces, and I understood immediately why the concordance avoided it. It was beautiful and dangerous in equal measure. The region was threaded with spatial anomalies, areas where the fabric of space itself was warped, folded, or torn by forces that our scientists were still working to understand. Radiation storms swept through vast stretches of the region, in patterns that defied prediction. Gravity wells appeared and disappeared without warning, like bubbles forming and popping in boiling water. Dead zones existed where no conventional sensor could penetrate, regions of complete electromagnetic silence that swallowed signals without echo. For a civilization that traveled by lane, the Void March was impassable. The spatial distortions would tear a lane corridor apart before it could stabilize. No ship using concordance technology could enter this region and expect to navigate safely, let alone explore it. That was why the concordance had marked it as restricted space and moved on. They had looked at the Void March, concluded that their technology could not handle it, and decided it was not worth the effort. Our technology did not have that problem. The fold-step drive did not use lanes. It did not need stable corridors of hyperspace. It folded normal space, and the anomalies of the Void March did not prevent that folding. If anything, Simon had theorized that the spatial distortions might actually make fold-step jumps easier in some areas, because the space was already partially folded by natural forces. We could go where the concordance could not. We could see what the concordance had never seen. The first week in the Void March was dedicated to careful exploration. Grace moved the fleet slowly, methodically, mapping anomalies and charting safe passages through the most turbulent regions. Nathan's navigation team worked around the clock, feeding data from the fleet's sensors into predictive models that grew more accurate with each passing day. The Damon network relays we deployed behind us maintained a solid communication link back to Earth, though the signal had to route around several particularly dense anomaly clusters. On the 9th day, Sophie Watts, who had transitioned from diplomatic biological compliance officer to frontier survey specialist, walked onto the bridge with an expression I had never seen on her face before. She looked like someone who had just been told a secret so enormous that the act of holding it inside was causing her physical discomfort. "We found something," she said. "What we found changed everything." The concordance had told us, and had told every species in the galaxy, that the Void March was empty, a hazardous wasteland of spatial anomalies and radiation, devoid of habitable worlds, containing nothing of value. This was stated as established fact in every concordance database, every educational archive, every navigational reference. The Void March was empty, and there was no reason to go there. The concordance was wrong, or it had lied, or it had simply never bothered to check, because the Void March was not empty at all. Sophie's survey team had detected biosignatures on a planet in a stable system nestled between two anomaly zones, a world that was shielded from the worst of the region's radiation by the very spatial distortions that made the Void March impassable for lane-based travel. And that planet was not the only one. As our sensors expanded their range over the following weeks, we found more. Dozens of habitable worlds scattered throughout the Void March, hidden behind curtains of gravitational distortion, protected by the same forces that kept the concordance out. And on those worlds, there was life. Not spacefaring civilizations, not species that had built ships and explored the stars. These were younger societies, peoples in early stages of development, cultures that had grown and flourished in isolation, because no one in the galaxy had ever reached them. They had watched the stars for generations and wondered if they were alone. No one had ever answered. The first species we made contact with were the Surathi. I will remember that day for as long as I live. The Perseverance descended through the atmosphere of a world called Surathis, a name we would later learn from its inhabitants, and Grace set us down in a clearing beside a river that ran copper-colored through a forest of trees that grew in spirals. The air tasted like rain and something faintly sweet that I later learned was the pollen of the spiral trees, which bloomed continuously throughout the planet's long growing season. The Surathi came to us. They did not hide. They did not run. They walked out of their settlement, a cluster of elegant structures built from woven wood and river stone, and they stood at the edge of the clearing and looked at our ship with expressions that I did not need a translation matrix to interpret. Wonder, pure, undiluted wonder, not fear, not hostility, just the overwhelming, breathtaking realization that the universe was bigger than they had imagined, and that something from outside had finally arrived. They were amphibian in basic physiology, with smooth skin that shifted colors slowly in response to their emotional state, from deep blue in calm to bright green in excitement. They were slightly shorter than humans, broad-shouldered, with wide eyes that reflected light like polished stone. Their hands had 6 fingers each, and they moved with a fluid grace that suggested they were as comfortable in water as on land. I stepped off the ship first. Protocol said the diplomatic coordinator should make initial contact, and for once protocol and common sense agreed. I walked across the clearing toward the group of Surathi standing at its edge, and I stopped at a respectful distance, and I waited. An elder came forward. I could tell she was an elder by the way the others deferred to her, and by the network of fine lines across her face that spoke of long years. Her skin was shifting slowly between blue and green, and her eyes were fixed on me with an intensity that made my chest tight. She spoke. I did not understand the words, but the translation matrix in my earpiece was already working, building a linguistic model from her phonemes, cross-referencing with the limited xenolinguistic databases we had brought from Earth. It took 47 seconds to produce a rough translation. 47 seconds during which I stood in a field on an alien world, looking at a person who had never seen a human before, while she looked back at me with eyes that held centuries of unanswered questions. The translation came through, rough and imprecise but intelligible. "Are you from the lights?" I understood what she meant. The lights, the stars, the points of brightness that the Surathi had watched from their world for generations, wondering, hoping, and never receiving an answer. "Yes," I said, and the translation matrix rendered my word into her language, as a sound like water running over smooth stones. "We come from a world that orbits one of those lights. We are called humans." The elder's skin turned fully green. Around her, the other Surathi shifted color too, a ripple of bright green spreading through the group like a wave. She reached out her hand toward me, palm up, 6 fingers spread. I did not know what the gesture meant, but I knew what it felt like. It felt like an invitation. I placed my hand on hers. Her skin was cool and smooth, and I felt a slight vibration through her palm that might have been her pulse, or might have been something else entirely. We stood like that for a moment, two people from two different worlds, connected by nothing more than the fact that we had both been alone for a very long time, and neither of us wanted to be alone anymore. There was no vote. There was no application process. There was no panel of judges deciding whether the Surathi were worthy of contact or whether humans were qualified to make it. There were just two species meeting for the first time and deciding, in that moment, to be friends. That was the difference. That was the thing I had been trying to articulate since the day of the rejection vote, and I had finally found it. The concordance treated contact as a transaction. You applied, you were assessed, you were accepted or denied. There were criteria, standards, benchmarks, quotas. It was a bureaucratic process applied to something that should have been a miracle. Meeting another intelligent species, touching a hand from another world, hearing a voice that had evolved under different stars, that was not a transaction. That was a gift. And gifts are not earned, they are given. The days that followed our first meeting with the Surathi elder were a masterclass in what first contact should have been all along. We did not arrive with forms to fill out, or assessments to conduct. We did not ask the Surathi to demonstrate their technological readiness or prove their cultural coherence. We sat with them by their copper-colored river and shared meals made from ingredients that neither species had ever tasted before. The Surathi cooked for us, slow-roasted roots from the spiral trees wrapped in riverweed that tasted like smoky honey. And we cooked for them, simple rice and lentils prepared in the Perseverance's galley that made their skin flush bright green with astonishment. Food, it turns out, is the most universal language in the galaxy. Every species eats. Every species understands the act of offering a stranger something from your table. The Surathi elder, whose name was Shun, spent long hours talking with me through the translation matrix, which grew more accurate with each conversation. She told me about her species' history, about the centuries of watching the stars, about the philosophical traditions that had grown up around the question of whether the lights in the sky held other minds. The Surathi had developed an entire branch of philosophy dedicated to the idea of cosmic companionship, the belief that intelligence was not meant to exist in isolation, that the universe had made thinking beings so that they could find each other and learn to think together. When I told her that the galaxy was full of intelligent species, that thousands of civilizations existed beyond her sky, her skin turned a color I had not seen before. A deep, luminous violet that Shun told me signified a feeling for which her language had no single word. The closest translation was something like the joy of a confirmed hope that you had been afraid was only a dream. Over the following months, we made contact with 11 more species in the Void March. Each encounter was different, and each one taught me something about the extraordinary variety of ways that intelligence can express itself in the universe. The Surathi had been philosophers and naturalists, a people who spent their lives studying the world around them with patient precision. They had mapped every species on their planet, catalogued the behavior of every creature, charted the movements of every river and weather system, all without the aid of electronic instruments. Their scientific method was based on patient observation, sustained across generations, with knowledge passed from elder to student through a tradition of oral teaching that stretched back thousands of years. On another world, we found the Toraneth, a species of avian beings who built their cities in the canopies of enormous trees and who communicated through complex songs that carried mathematical information encoded in their harmonic structures. The first time I heard a Toraneth greeting song, I thought it was simply beautiful music. It was only later, when our linguistic team analyzed the harmonic patterns, that we realized the song had contained a precise mathematical description of the singer's location, altitude, heading, speed, family lineage, and emotional state, all encoded in the intervals between notes. Their entire civilization ran on information transmitted through song. Their architecture, their navigation, their governance, their history, all of it was sung. They had no written language because they had never needed one. Sound was their medium, and they had mastered it to a degree that made our most advanced acoustic engineering look like banging rocks together. On a rocky planet deep in the Void March's interior, we encountered the Paloon, a subterranean species that navigated by sonar and had developed a form of architecture that was essentially sculpted sound, buildings whose shapes were designed to create specific acoustic environments. Walking into a Paloon dwelling was like walking into a musical instrument. Every surface was curved and angled to direct sound in specific ways, creating spaces that felt peaceful or energizing or contemplative, depending on the shapes of the walls around you. The Paloon had never seen the stars. They lived beneath the surface of their world, in vast cavern systems that they had carved and shaped over centuries. When we showed them images of the galaxy from the Perseverance's observation deck, they stood in silent contemplation for so long that I began to worry we had overwhelmed them. Then their elder turned to me and said, through the translation matrix, "We always knew the universe was larger than our caves. We just did not know it was also beautiful." None of them had ever made contact with another species. None of them had known that life existed beyond their own worlds. And none of them had been contacted by the Concordance, because the Concordance had never come to the Void March, because the Void March was empty. The irony was thick enough to taste. The galaxy's most ancient and powerful political institution had declared an entire region of space uninhabitable and worthless. And inside that region, dozens of civilizations had grown up unseen and unheard, waiting for someone to notice them. The Concordance had not noticed, because noticing would have required going to a place their technology could not reach. Humanity had noticed because humanity had been forced to develop technology that could. We also found resources. The Void March was rich in ways that Concordant space was not. Rare quantum lattice minerals that did not appear on any galactic trade index. Elements with properties that our physicists had theorized about but never observed. Spatial phenomena that could be harnessed for energy generation on scales that dwarfed anything in the Concordance's power infrastructure. The Void March was not a wasteland. It was a treasure chest that the galaxy's oldest civilizations had been sitting next to for millennia, without ever opening the lid. I sat on the outer hull of the Perseverance one evening, sealed inside a pressure suit, looking out at a nebula that no Concordance eye had ever seen. The nebula was vast and complex, a cloud of gas and dust that glowed in shades of violet and gold, lit from within by the light of young stars being born in its depths. It was one of the most beautiful things I had ever seen, and I was the first human to see it, and I was only seeing it because 4,000 alien civilizations had told us we were not welcome in their part of the sky. They locked us out of their house, so we found a continent. The rumors started slowly, the way fires start in dry forests. A spark here, a wisp of smoke there. Nothing dramatic, until suddenly the whole horizon is glowing. I learned about the rumors from an intelligence briefing that landed on my desk 7 years after the rejection vote. By then, I had been promoted to senior coordinator of the Terran Frontier Network, which was the official name for the growing web of relationships between Earth and the Void March species we had contacted. My office was on the Perseverance, which had become a permanent diplomatic station in orbit around Sarathis. I liked working there. The view of the spiral tree forests from my window was better than anything Geneva had to offer. The briefing came from our signals intelligence team, a group of very clever people who spent their days monitoring Concordance communication traffic that leaked through the edges of the resonance grid into our Damon network receivers. They could not decrypt the high-priority diplomatic channels, but they could intercept the lower-tier commercial and civilian traffic, and what they found in that traffic was fascinating. The Concordance was talking about us. Not officially. There had been no formal acknowledgement of humanity's activities since the rejection vote. As far as the Concordance's official records were concerned, Earth was a minor rejected applicant that had retreated to its home system and would presumably spend the next few centuries being irrelevant. But below the official silence, in the commercial channels and the trader networks and the informal communications between minor species, the talk was everywhere. The humans are in the Void March. The humans found habitable worlds. The humans have made contact with unknown species. The humans are building something. The details were garbled, exaggerated, and frequently wrong. One widely circulated rumor claimed we had discovered a cache of ancient weapons left by a precursor civilization, and were using them to carve out an empire. Another insisted we had genetically merged ourselves with a Void March species and become something post-human. A third, which I found particularly amusing, suggested we had encountered a being of pure energy that had granted us cosmic powers in exchange for teaching it how to play chess. The truth was less dramatic, but more interesting. We were building a community. Not an empire, not a federation, not a hierarchy. A community. The Terran Frontier Network was a loose alliance of equals, with Earth as the founding world but not the ruling one. Each member species governed itself. Each contributed what it could and received what it needed. Decisions were made by consensus when consensus was possible, and by compromise when it was not. It was messy, and slow, and sometimes frustrating, and it was the most honest political structure I had ever been part of. The Velthrani were the last to take the rumors seriously. Their intelligence analysts dismissed the reports as exaggerations from unreliable sources. The Void March was impassable. Everyone knew that. Whatever the humans were doing, they could not possibly be doing it in a region of space that no ship could safely navigate. The Velthrani elders were confident in this assessment, because it was based on a fundamental truth that had been true for 10,000 years. Their lane technology could not penetrate the Void March. Therefore, no technology could. They had not considered the possibility that someone might build a different kind of technology. The Shun Collective, being a hive mind that valued data over assumptions, ran probability models on the rumors and got results that did not make sense. Their models kept producing contradictory outputs, assigning high probability to scenarios that should have been impossible based on known physics. This troubled the Shun deeply, because the Shun did not like contradictions. They sent a formal inquiry to the Concordance Science Council, asking whether any species had developed space-folding technology that did not rely on lane corridors. The Science Council replied that such technology was theoretically impossible, and that the Shun should recalibrate their models. The Shun did not recalibrate their models. Instead, they quietly opened a secondary analysis channel and began collecting data more aggressively. Meanwhile, trade was happening. The Concordance operated on a closed economic model. All interstellar trade flowed through Concordance-regulated channels, using Concordance-approved routes, paying Concordance-assessed tariffs. Member species traded with each other inside this system, and non-members were excluded entirely. It was efficient, stable, and had been the foundation of galactic commerce for millennia. It was also, as several economists on Earth had pointed out, essentially a monopoly. Our Damon network relays were the first crack in that monopoly. The relays were communication devices, simple, robust quantum mesh transceivers that could be deployed anywhere and linked into a decentralized network that did not depend on the resonance grid. They were not as fast as the grid for long-range communication, but they were cheap, easy to install, and free. No access fees, no licensing agreements, no bureaucratic approval process. Just plug them in and start talking. Independent traders, the ones who operated on the margins of concordant space, noticed. These were merchants from minor species who had always resented the grid's access fees, which ate into their already thin profit margins. When rumors began circulating that the humans were selling network relays at a fraction of what a grid connection cost, traders started finding ways to reach us. They came through roundabout routes, slipping past concordance border monitors, following coordinates passed through whisper networks and black market channels. They found our frontier stations, and what they found there went beyond communication relays. We had biome hull seeds, small biological packages that could be attached to the exterior of any ship, and would grow into self-repairing organic hull material over a period of weeks. A ship with biome hull coating could heal micrometeorite damage, seal minor breaches, and adapt its thermal properties to different environments without any mechanical intervention. The Concordance had nothing equivalent. Their ships were maintained by dedicated engineering crews using expensive replacement parts manufactured in specialized orbital facilities. Biome hull seeds cost almost nothing to produce and required no maintenance infrastructure at all. We also had Void March minerals, elements, and compounds that did not appear in any Concordance trade catalog because they had never been found in Concordance space. Some of these materials had extraordinary properties. Quantum lattice crystals that could store and process information at densities that made conventional computing hardware look like abacus beads. Resonance active alloys that vibrated at frequencies useful for medical diagnostics, industrial manufacturing, and communications enhancement. Thermal shift compounds that could regulate temperature with a precision that made environmental control systems obsolete. The economics of the situation were quietly devastating for the Concordance's trade model. For millennia, the Concordance had maintained price stability through control of supply. The founding species owned the patents, the manufacturing processes, and the distribution networks for virtually every advanced material in galactic commerce. New members paid for access to these materials through a complex web of trade agreements, licensing fees, and technology sharing arrangements that ultimately funneled wealth upward to the founding species. It was not exploitation in any crude sense. The materials were genuinely valuable, and the prices were not unreasonable by historical standards. But the system depended on the assumption that there were no alternatives, no other sources of advanced materials, No independent manufacturing capability. No competing supply chain. We were an alternative. Not deliberately, not strategically, but simply by existing. Our Void March minerals were different from concordance materials, but they performed the same functions, often better, and they were available without the overhead of concordance trade bureaucracy. A Toraneth communications engineer could buy a quantum lattice crystal from us for the cost of a cultural exchange visit, or she could buy a comparable concordance computing substrate for a price that included manufacturing fees, distribution markups, lane transport charges, and a licensing surcharge that went directly to the Velthrani treasury. The choice was not difficult. The black market grew. Concordance border security tried to clamp down on it, but the traders were resourceful, and the border was long, and the Damon network made coordination easy. Within 2 years of the first unauthorized trade contact, a steady stream of goods and information was flowing between the Terran frontier network and the fringes of concordant space. The Kethari made it official first. Sarah, the delegate who had given me the data chip years ago, arrived at our frontier station aboard a private vessel with no concordance markings. She came as an unofficial envoy, carrying credentials that were not quite diplomatic, but not quite commercial either. She existed in a gray area that the Kethari had carefully constructed for exactly this purpose. We met in my office on the Perseverance. She was taller than I remembered, and the silver patterns in her eyes were brighter, shifting with complex emotions that I had learned to read during our years of occasional communication. The Kethari have been dissatisfied with the concordance for a very long time, she told me, sitting in a chair that I had adjusted to accommodate her longer frame. We joined because there was no alternative. The concordance was the galaxy. If you were not part of it, you did not exist. But we never accepted the founding species' assumption that their way of doing things was the only way. We have been waiting for proof that alternatives exist. And now? And now you are building one. She paused. The Kethari wish to establish a formal friendship treaty with Earth and its partners. Not a trade agreement, not a non-aggression pact. A friendship, between equals. I signed the treaty the following day. It was the first formal agreement between a concordance member species and the Terran Frontier Network, and it sent a signal that I suspect the Velthrani picked up even through the walls of their own denial. The Velthrani eventually decided they needed information that did not come from rumors and probability models. They pressured the Concordance Intelligence Directorate into dispatching a surveillance drone to the Void March. The drone was one of their best, a small, fast, heavily shielded autonomous probe designed for long-range reconnaissance in hostile environments. The drone entered the Void March and immediately began encountering spatial anomalies that pushed the limits of its shielding. It navigated through them using a combination of pre-programmed evasion protocols and real-time sensor adaptation, and after 12 days of careful travel, it reached the outer boundary of the Terran Frontier Network. Our patrol ship detected it within minutes. The crew of the patrol ship, a mixed human and Surathi team, aboard a biome hull corvette, hailed the drone on open frequencies and received no response, which was expected since it was a surveillance drone, and surveillance drones were not designed for conversation. The patrol commander, a young officer named Lucy Grant, who was the daughter of my former deputy, and who had chosen the frontier over the diplomatic corps to her mother's quiet dismay, made a decision that I would later describe as one of the most strategically brilliant moves in human diplomatic history. She invited the drone to tea. Not literally, of course. Drones do not drink tea. But Lucy transmitted a formal invitation for the drone to accompany her ship on a guided tour of the nearest frontier settlement, with full sensor access and no restrictions on data collection. She then ordered her crew to beam a cultural gift package to the drone's receiver, which included a selection of Earth's finest teas, a Surathi poetry collection translated into 17 concordance languages, and a personal note from Lucy that read, "Welcome to the neighborhood. We have nothing to hide." The drone followed the patrol ship. It observed a frontier settlement of mixed species, humans and Surathi and Toraneth and others, living and working together in orbital habitats grown from biome hull material and powered by energy systems the drone's analysis software could not identify. It recorded ships coming and going, some human-built, some of designs it did not recognize. It documented trade exchanges, communication traffic on the Damon network, and the general atmosphere of a community that was busy, productive, and completely unconcerned about being watched. The drone returned to concordance space after 3 weeks. It carried more data in its storage banks than any reconnaissance mission in Concordance history. When that data was presented to the Grand Conclave in a closed session, the reaction was not what the Velthrani had expected. They had expected confirmation that the humans were struggling, scraping by on the margins in a hostile region of space, building crude imitations of real technology, and pretending they did not need the Concordance. What the data showed was something very different. The humans were thriving. Their technology was not crude. Their alliance was not a pretense, and they were not alone anymore. The drone's footage included something that the Conclave found particularly difficult to process. It had recorded a celebration on one of the frontier settlements, a harvest festival that the Surathi traditionally held at the end of their long growing season. The festival had been adapted to include customs from every species in the settlement. Human musicians played alongside Toraneth singers. Surathi dancers moved in patterns that incorporated Paloon acoustic design principles, their movements creating sound as well as visual beauty. Children from 3 different species played a game together that appeared to have been invented specifically for them, with rules that accommodated different body types and sensory abilities. The footage showed a community that was not merely coexisting, but genuinely integrated. A society in which the differences between species were not barriers to be overcome, but ingredients to be combined. The Concordance had never produced anything like this. In the Concordance, species maintained their separate identities, their separate territories, their separate traditions. They cooperated when cooperation served their interests, and they retreated to their own worlds when it did not. Integration at the level the drone had observed was not just unusual, it was unprecedented. It suggested a social model that the Concordance's founding principles did not account for and could not explain. The Velthrani matriarch who had led the rejection campaign sat in her floating platform and watched the footage of Lucy Grant's patrol ship, a living vessel with a self-healing hull that glowed with soft bioluminescence, escorting a Concordance surveillance drone through a neighborhood of species the Concordance had never known existed. Her compound eyes reflected the images without expression, but the younger delegates on surrounding platforms were not so controlled. I was told later that the whispered conversations that filled the chamber after the presentation were louder and more numerous than anything the Grand Conclave had heard in centuries. The humans had been shunned, and they had built something without asking. The galaxy was starting to notice. 10 years after the vote that was supposed to end our story, I sat in a conference room on a station that had not existed 5 years earlier and watched the balance of galactic power shift in real time. The station was called Threshold 1, named after the initiative that had started all of this, and it orbited a gas giant in the central Void March. It was the largest structure the Terran Frontier Network had built, a sprawling complex of grown and fabricated sections that served as the administrative hub for what we now called the Terran Open Compact. The name change had been necessary because the network had outgrown the word network. We were not a loose alliance of trading partners anymore. We were something more substantial, more permanent, and more threatening to the established order than anyone had anticipated, including us. The Terran Open Compact consisted of 31 member species. Earth was the founding world, but it held no special authority. Each member had an equal voice in the Compact Council, which met monthly in a chamber aboard Threshold 1 that had been specifically designed to accommodate the physical requirements of every member species. The chamber had sections with different atmospheric compositions, different gravity settings, different lighting spectra, and different acoustic properties. It was, in a practical sense, a room that contained 31 different environments simultaneously, separated by transparent barriers that allowed visual contact while maintaining each species' comfort. It was ridiculous and wonderful, and it worked. I was in the conference room adjacent to the council chamber, reviewing intelligence summaries with Helen Cross, who was now the Compact's Secretary General, a title she had accepted reluctantly, and performed with the same focused intensity she had brought to particle physics. 87, she said, pointing at a number on the display. 87 what? Species. In the last 14 months, 87 Concordance member species have formally withdrawn from the Concordance, or downgraded their membership to observer status. I leaned back in my chair. That is more than double the number from last year. It is accelerating. The pattern is consistent. Small and medium-sized species, the ones that have always been marginalized within the Concordance's hierarchical structure, are leaving. They are not joining the Compact directly. because that would trigger concordance sanctions during the withdrawal transition period. Instead, they declare independence first, wait out the mandatory cooling period, and then open trade and diplomatic relations with us. The concordance is bleeding members. The concordance is losing the species it never valued in the first place. The founding members, the Velthrani, the Dravine, the Rushan, they are all still firmly in place. The power structure of the concordance remains intact, but the economic base is shrinking. Every species that leaves takes its trade volume, its resource contributions, and its manufacturing capacity with it. The concordance is like a building losing bricks from the lower floors. The penthouse is still standing, but the foundation is developing cracks. The brain drain was not limited to political membership. Individual scientists, engineers, artists, and scholars from concordant species were migrating to the Void March in increasing numbers. Some came officially, through the channels established by the Cathari Friendship Treaty, and the growing number of similar agreements with other species. Others came unofficially, arriving at frontier stations on private vessels with little more than their personal equipment, and a desire to work somewhere that was not constrained by 10,000 years of institutional inertia. The pattern was consistent across species. The individuals who came to us were invariably the ones who had been frustrated by the concordance's intellectual conservatism, the ones who had ideas that did not fit within the established frameworks, the ones who had been told that certain questions were not worth asking, or that certain approaches were not worth pursuing. In the concordance, orthodoxy was not just a preference, it was a structural requirement. The founding species had laid down the laws of physics, the methods of engineering, the principles of biology, and the framework of mathematics. Everything that came after was built on that foundation, and questioning the foundation was treated not as scientific inquiry but as a form of disrespect. In the compact, there was no foundation to disrespect. There were only questions, and anyone could ask them, and any answer that worked was accepted regardless of whose traditions it violated. This made the compact intellectually chaotic by concordant standards, but it also made it the most productive research environment in the galaxy. Ideas that would have taken centuries to develop in the concordance's careful, hierarchical system were being tested, refined, and deployed in the compact in years or even months. The pace was exhilarating and occasionally alarming, and it attracted exactly the kind of minds that the concordance could least afford to lose. I met a Velthrani engineer during this period, a young female named Kessa who had left her homeworld against the explicit instructions of her clan matriarch. She had specialized in energy systems at the Velthrani Academy of Applied Sciences, the most prestigious technical institution in the concordance, and she had grown increasingly frustrated with the Academy's refusal to explore any energy generation method that deviated from the founding species' established models. I proposed a research project on gravitational energy harvesting, she told me during her intake interview at Threshold 1. Her compound eyes held patterns of orange and gold that I had learned to associate with agitation. The concept was sound. The mathematics supported it. My advisor told me it was inappropriate because it contradicted the established understanding of gravitational dynamics. Contradicted it how? It suggested that the established understanding was incomplete. And that was unacceptable? At the Velthrani Academy, suggesting that the founders were incomplete is the same as suggesting they were wrong. And the founders are never wrong. Kessa joined a compact research team that was doing exactly the kind of work her academy had forbidden. Within 8 months, her gravitational energy harvesting concept had progressed from theory to prototype. Within a year, it was operational. The irony was not lost on anyone. The technology gap between the compact and the concordance was shifting, and it was shifting in a direction that the concordance found deeply uncomfortable. For 10,000 years, the founding species had held the technological high ground. Their science was the science. Their methods were the methods. Other species could refine and apply what the founders had established, but the fundamental principles were settled and not subject to revision. This arrangement had produced a galaxy that was remarkably stable and remarkably stagnant, a civilization that had reached a plateau of capability and then remained on that plateau, comfortably, for millennia. The compact did not have a plateau. The compact had a trajectory, and the trajectory was steep. The pivotal moment came at a joint engineering summit hosted on Threshold 1, attended by representatives from every compact species, and observed remotely by several concordance intelligence services that we politely pretended not to notice. Simon Blake, now the compact's chief technology advisor, and something of a folk hero among frontier engineers, presented the results of a 3-year collaboration between human physicists, Surathi spatial theorists, and Kethari energy specialists. They had built a cascade reactor. I watched Simon present the data, and even though I understood perhaps a quarter of the physics involved, I understood the implications completely. The Concordance's energy infrastructure was based on stellar fusion, the process of extracting power from stars using orbiting collection arrays. It was clean, abundant, and had been the standard across the galaxy for longer than anyone could remember. It also had a hard ceiling. There was a maximum amount of energy you could extract from a star without destabilizing it, and the Concordance had reached that ceiling centuries ago. Their civilization ran at maximum power, and maximum power was all it would ever have. The Cascade reactor did not use stellar fusion. It used the spatial anomalies of the Void March itself as fuel, the distortions, the warps, the tears in the fabric of space that made the region so hazardous. All of that instability contained enormous amounts of energy. Energy that the Concordance had never learned to tap because they had never gone near it. The Cascade reactor converted spatial distortion into usable power with an efficiency that made stellar fusion look like burning wood. And it did not have a ceiling. The energy output of a single Cascade reactor exceeded the total output of the Concordance's largest stellar collection array. A network of Cascade reactors, deployed across the Void March's many anomaly zones, could theoretically power a civilization of unlimited size. There was no maximum, there was no plateau. The power just kept scaling. Simon finished his presentation, and the summit chamber was silent for 4 full seconds, which was an eternity in a room full of engineers. Then the questions started, and they did not stop for 3 days. The Concordance's response to the Cascade reactor announcement was its first official communication with Earth in a decade. It arrived through diplomatic channels that had been dormant since the rejection vote, addressed to the governing authority of the Terran species, in language so carefully neutral that it must have taken a committee of linguists weeks to compose. The message was an invitation to reopen dialogue on matters of mutual interest and shared galactic responsibility. It acknowledged, in the vaguest possible terms, that developments in frontier regions had created opportunities for constructive exchange. It did not mention the rejection vote. It did not mention the Void March. It did not use the words mistake, or reconsider, or apologize. It simply pretended that the relationship between Earth and the Concordance had been paused rather than severed, and suggested it might be nice to unpause it. I helped draft Earth's response. It took us an afternoon. The response was friendly, warm, and magnificently non-committal. The Terran Open Compact welcomes the Concordance's interest in dialogue and values the spirit of cooperation that this communication represents. We are always open to conversations with any species or organization that shares our commitment to mutual respect and shared progress. Unfortunately, our current schedule of commitments and ongoing projects makes it difficult to identify a suitable window for formal talks in the immediate future. We suggest revisiting this matter in the next quarter and will be happy to coordinate scheduling at that time. Helen read the draft and raised an eyebrow. Next quarter? We are busy, I said. Genuinely busy. This is not a tactic. I know it is not a tactic, but they will think it is. Let them. The Concordance did think it was a tactic, and the fact that it was not a tactic made it more effective than any tactic could have been. A deliberate delay would have been a negotiating move, something the Concordance's diplomats could analyze and counter. A genuine lack of interest was something they had no framework for understanding. In the Concordance's worldview, every species wanted to be part of the Concordance. The idea that a species might simply have other priorities was not a concept their political philosophy had room for. Inside the Concordance, the fallout from our response was significant. The Velthrani leadership faced internal dissent that would have been unthinkable a decade earlier. Younger delegates openly questioned the wisdom of the original rejection vote. Analysts published reports arguing that the exclusion of humanity had been a strategic error of historic proportions. The Velthrani elders responded the way ancient institutions always respond to criticism. They dug in. They insisted that the rejection had been correct, that humanity was a temporary anomaly, and that the compact would eventually collapse under the weight of its own disorganization. The younger delegates were not convinced. One of them reached out to me through a back channel established by the Kethari diplomatic network. Her name was Thassan, and she was the youngest member of the Velthrani delegation to the Grand Conclave. a position she had earned through exceptional ability, and that she was now risking by communicating with the species her elders had voted to exclude. We spoke via a secure daemon network connection, her face appearing on my display as a mosaic of compound eyes and angular features, rendered in the warm amber tones of the Velthrani visual spectrum. "I need you to understand something about the vote," she said without any preliminary politeness, which I respected. "I am listening." The official grounds for rejection were biological instability, cultural incoherence, technological prematurity, and diplomatic volatility. Those were the publicly stated reasons. They were not the real reasons. I waited. The real reason was a risk assessment conducted by the Velthrani Strategic Forecasting Bureau 18 months before the vote. The assessment modeled the trajectory of human technological and cultural development over a 500-year period, using every data point available from our observation of your species. The model produced a conclusion that the Bureau found unacceptable. What conclusion? Thesson's compound eyes shifted pattern. That within 3 centuries of Concordance membership, humanity would surpass the founding species in technological capability, economic output, and cultural influence. The model predicted that human creativity, which the Bureau classified as chaotic innovation potential, would produce breakthroughs at a rate that no existing concordant species could match. The founding species would lose their position of primacy. The concordance's power structure would be fundamentally altered. So the rejection was not about our readiness. The rejection was about control. You were denied membership because the models predicted you would eventually become too powerful to control. The elders chose containment over inclusion. They believed that without access to lane travel, the resonance grid, and concordance trade networks, your development would stall, and you would spend the next few centuries as an irrelevant species confined to a single star system. That did not work. No, Thesson said. It did not. I sat with that information for a long time after the call ended. I was not surprised. Some part of me had suspected something like this since the day of the vote, since the moment I saw the margin of rejection and understood that it was too large, too coordinated, too uniform to be the result of genuine concern about our biology or our culture. It had been a political operation, not an assessment. The Velthrani had decided to shut us out, and they had whipped the votes to make it happen. But knowing the truth did not make me angry. It made me sad. Sad for the Velthrani, sad for the concordance, sad for a galaxy that had chosen fear over curiosity, control over cooperation, stagnation over growth. I thought about the Sarathi elder who had reached out her hand to me in the clearing on her homeworld, and I thought about the Velthrani matriarch who had sat in her floating platform and watched me walk away, and I understood that the difference between those 2 moments was the difference between a civilization that was still growing and one that had stopped. Imagine being so afraid of the future that you try to vote it out of existence. Imagine building a galaxy-spanning parliament and using it to lock the door against anyone who might change things. Imagine having 10,000 years of accumulated knowledge and power and using it to stand still. The Concordants had not rejected us because we were too primitive. They had rejected us because we were too alive. The distress signal arrived at 3 in the morning, station time. I was asleep in my quarters on Threshold 1, when the emergency alert pulled me out of a dream I immediately forgot. The alert tone was one I had never heard before, a deep, pulsing harmonic that vibrated through the walls and the floor and my teeth. It was the Compact's highest priority warning, a signal designated for events that threatened not just a single station or fleet, but the survival of multiple species. I was dressed and on the command deck in 4 minutes. Helen was already there, standing at the central display with her arms crossed and her face showing an expression I had seen only once before, the day she had told me about Threshold for the first time. Controlled intensity, a mind processing information faster than a mouth could report it. "What happened?" I said. She pointed at the display. A 3-dimensional map of the border region between Concordant space and the Void March rotated slowly, and at its center, a pulsing red marker indicated something that should not have been there. 12 hours ago, a spatial anomaly opened in the border region, Helen said. It is not like the anomalies in the Void March. Those are natural, stable enough to map and navigate around. This one is different. It is a rupture, a tear in the fabric of subspace itself, and it is expanding. How fast? At its current rate, It will consume the 3 nearest star systems within 90 days, 6 more within a year. I stared at the display. 9 star systems, billions of inhabitants, concordant citizens and compact partners alike. What caused it? We do not know yet. Our spatial physics teams are analyzing the data, but the rupture's energy signature does not match anything in our models. Simon is already on his way here with a team from the Buenos Aires lab. He says the preliminary readings suggest it is not natural. Not natural. He thinks something triggered it, something deep in the galactic core. He used the word activation, as if a mechanism that had been dormant was suddenly turned on. Over the next 48 hours, the picture became clearer and worse. The rupture, which the media quickly began calling simply the rupture, was growing at an accelerating rate. Spatial distortions radiated outward from its center, like ripples from a stone dropped into water, and those distortions were wreaking havoc on everything they touched. Gravitational fields warped, electromagnetic spectra shifted, and most critically for the concordance, the lane travel corridors in the affected region began to destabilize. The lanes were rigid structures. They depended on precise spatial geometry to function, and the rupture's distortions were bending that geometry out of tolerance. One by one, the lane corridors in the border region collapsed. Ships that had been mid-transit were thrown out of hyperspace into normal space at random locations, some damaged, some destroyed. Ships that had not yet entered the lanes found themselves unable to do so. The Concordance's primary means of transportation had simply stopped working in an expanding zone around the rupture. For the Concordance, this was catastrophic. Their entire civilization was built on the assumption that the lane network would always function. Their economies depended on it. Their military deployments required it. Their evacuation protocols assumed lane travel as the baseline for moving populations out of danger zones. Without the lanes, the Concordance's fleets were reduced to sublight travel, which was far too slow to evacuate the billions of people in the rupture's path. The Grand Conclave convened an emergency session. I was not present, but the Kethari provided us with a real-time account of the proceedings through their diplomatic channels. The session was, by all accounts, one of the most chaotic in Concordance history. Delegations demanded action, but no one could agree on what action to take. The Velthrani proposed deploying their fleet to stabilize the lane corridors by force, a plan that their own engineers admitted had a low probability of success. The Rushan Collective proposed a controlled collapse of the border lanes to prevent the distortion from spreading to the wider network, a plan that would save the network but abandon the populations in the affected systems. The Dravine proposed nothing at all and sat in their massive platforms in granite silence. Nobody proposed asking us for help, not at first. The silence on that particular option was telling. I learned later from the Kethari intelligence reports that at least 40 delegations had privately considered suggesting it, but none of them wanted to be the first to say the words aloud. To ask humanity for help was to acknowledge that the species the Concordance had rejected possessed capabilities the Concordance did not. It was to admit that the rejection had been wrong, that the Void March exploration had been right, that the entire edifice of Concordance technological supremacy was built on a foundation that had a crack in it the size of a small civilization. No one wanted to be the delegate who said those words and became the face of that admission. Meanwhile, people were dying. The spatial distortions had already claimed 2 research stations and a civilian transport that had been caught in a gravity shear between collapsing lane corridors. The death toll was climbing. Emergency shelters on the inhabited worlds in the rupture's path were filling with families who had nowhere to go and no way to leave. The most powerful political institution in the galaxy was watching its citizens face destruction and arguing about procedure. It was the Kethari who finally said it. Sarah, who had risen to the position of senior delegate in the years since she had given me the data chip, stood in the Grand Conclave and pointed out what should have been obvious. The humans had technology that worked without lane corridors. The humans had ships that could navigate spatial distortions. The humans had been operating in conditions similar to the rupture zone for years, because the Void March was full of spatial anomalies, and the humans had built their entire frontier infrastructure around the ability to function within them. If we want to save those people, Sarah said, and I was told her voice was steady and clear in a chamber full of raised voices, we need to ask the species we expelled from this chamber to come back and help us. The Velthrani objected. Of course they objected. Asking humanity for help was an admission that the rejection had been wrong, and the Velthrani were not ready to make that admission. But the clock was running. The rupture was growing, and the billions of people in its path did not care about Velthrani pride. The request arrived through the Kethari diplomatic channel, because the Concordance's official channels were still tangled in procedural objections about whether a formal request for assistance from a non-member species was even legally permissible. The request was not elegant. It was not wrapped in diplomatic language. It was a raw, desperate, undisguised plea for help. Helen did not hesitate. She did not convene a committee. She did not consult the Compact Council, though she informed them immediately afterward. She opened the Damon network to the Concordance's emergency frequencies and broadcast a single message on all channels. This is Secretary General Helen Cross of the Terran Open Compact. We are coming. Hold on. The Compact fleet mobilized in 6 hours. 43 ships from 12 species, led by the Perseverance, and carrying every available fold-step drive unit and cascade reactor module. Grace Elliott commanded the fleet from the Perseverance's bridge, and I stood beside her because there was nowhere else I could imagine being. We jumped into the rupture zone, and for the first time since I had watched the stars rearrange themselves on our maiden voyage into the Void March, I felt genuine fear. The rupture was enormous. It dominated the viewport like a wound in the sky, a jagged tear in the darkness that glowed with a sickly amber light, and pulsed with rhythms that felt wrong, not in any way I could articulate technically, but in some deeper, more instinctive sense. It was like looking at something that should not exist, a violation of the fundamental rules that held reality together. The space around it was warped and churning, and through the distortions, I could see the faint points of light that were star systems with inhabited worlds, worlds full of people who had no way to leave. Our fold-step drives worked. They worked as they had always worked in the Void March, folding space around the distortions, stepping through the chaos like a person walking between raindrops. The Concordance ships that were stranded in the zone could not believe what they were seeing. We appeared out of nowhere, ship after ship, materializing in stable space pockets throughout the danger area. Our Damon network relays immediately established communication links with every stranded vessel and every inhabited station, creating a coordination grid that replaced the collapsed resonance grid nodes. The evacuation began. I will not describe every moment of it, because the scope was too large and too complex for any single perspective to capture. I can tell you what I saw from the Perseverance. I can tell you about the Velthrani colony ship that we found drifting in a gravity shear, its lane drive burnt out, its life support failing, carrying 14,000 people. Grace brought the Perseverance alongside, and our crew established hull-to-hull contact using biome hull connectors that bonded with the colony ship's exterior and formed an airtight seal in minutes. We began transferring passengers immediately. 14,000 Velthrani walked through a corridor of living material grown from human technology, from their crippled ship to ours, and every one of them was given water, food, and a safe place to sit. I can tell you about the mixed convoy that Nathan Ellis navigated through a field of gravitational distortions so dense that conventional navigation would have been suicide. Nathan used the spatial mapping techniques we had developed in the Void March, reading the distortion patterns like a sailor reading currents, finding paths of relative stability through the chaos, and guiding 37 ships carrying over 200,000 evacuees along those paths to safety. I can tell you about the Surathi medical teams who worked alongside human doctors in improvised triage centers on every ship in the fleet, treating injuries caused by the spatial distortions, decompression accidents, and the sheer physical stress of emergency evacuation. The Surathi had no prior experience with Velthrani physiology, but they learned fast, and their calm, methodical approach to medicine complemented the human doctor's intensity in ways that saved lives. I watched a Surathi healer and a human surgeon work side by side on a Velthrani child who had been injured during the gravitational shear that damaged her colony ship. The Surathi steadied the child with gentle hands, her skin cycling through calming shades of blue that seemed to ease the child's distress, while the surgeon worked with quick, precise movements to stabilize a fracture that Velthrani anatomy made complicated. They did not speak the same language. They did not share a species or a homeworld or a medical tradition. But they saved that child's life together, and when it was done, the Surathi healer placed her hand on the surgeon's shoulder, and her skin turned a shade of green that meant gratitude, and the surgeon nodded, and they moved to the next patient without a word. I can tell you about the communication officers who worked around the clock on the Damon network, coordinating the movements of hundreds of ships across a zone of space, where conventional communication was unreliable. Every relay had to be repositioned constantly as the spatial distortions shifted, and every coordination signal had to be routed through a maze of interference patterns that changed by the hour. A young communications specialist named Oliver Penn, who had been recruited out of a university program in Edinburgh and who had never seen anything more dangerous than a laboratory simulation, spent 72 hours without sleep keeping the coordination network functional. When I ordered him to rest, he looked at me with red-rimmed eyes and said, "There are ships out there that need to know where to go. I will rest when they are safe." He rested 4 hours later, when the last ship in his sector cleared the distortion zone, and he slept for 14 hours straight on the floor of the communications bay, because he did not make it to his bunk. And I can tell you about the moment that still wakes me up at night, not with fear, but with a complicated emotion that sits somewhere between pride and grief. Simon Blake had devised a plan to stop the rupture, not just to evacuate people from its path, but to actually close it. The plan was audacious, untested, and relied on a theoretical framework that Simon himself admitted was only about 70% complete. The idea was to use a network of cascade reactors, deployed in a specific pattern around the rupture's perimeter, to generate a counter-distortion field that would essentially stitch subspace back together. Each reactor would produce a localized spatial stabilization effect, and the overlapping effects from multiple reactors would, in theory, create a pressure that pushed the tear closed. The problem was that the reactors had to be placed precisely, and some of the placement points were deep inside the rupture's most violent distortion zones. Ships that carried reactors to those points would be operating in conditions where even fold-step drives were unreliable. The spatial distortions near the rupture's core were so extreme that the probability of a successful fold-step jump dropped below 50%. Any ship that went in might not come out. Simon presented the plan on the Perseverance's bridge, surrounded by the senior officers of the fleet and the holographic projections of Compact and Concordance commanders, who were monitoring from safer positions. He did not sugarcoat the risks. "The core placements are the critical ones," he said, pointing to 7 positions on the 3-dimensional map of the rupture. "Without those reactors in place, the network will not generate enough counter-distortion to close the tier. The outer placements can be done safely. The core placements cannot." "What is the survival probability for crews at the core positions?" Grace asked. Simon paused. "Variable. Some positions are more hazardous than others. For the 3 deepest placements, the probability of successful deployment and retrieval is between 20 and 35%. The bridge was very quiet. "Volunteers only," Grace said. "This is not an order." Every ship in the fleet volunteered. Every single one. Human crews, Sarathi crews, Toraneth crews, Kethari crews, they all offered to take the core positions. Grace selected the 7 teams based on equipment readiness and drive calibration, and when the selections were announced, the crews that were chosen did not celebrate or make speeches. They checked their equipment, ran their pre-flight calculations, and departed. 3 of the 7 core deployment ships did not return. The reactors they carried were successfully placed before contact was lost. The cascade network activated. The counter-distortion field generated by the combined output of all reactors, core and perimeter, produced a pressure wave that propagated inward from all directions simultaneously. The rupture resisted. It pulsed and surged and seemed to fight against the closure. And for 17 minutes that lasted approximately 7 years in subjective experience, I stood on the bridge of the Perseverance and watched the display and did not breathe. Then the rupture collapsed. Not slowly, not gracefully, but suddenly, like a door slamming shut. The amber light vanished, the spatial distortions smoothed, the gravitational shears flattened. The stars settled back into their proper positions, and the sky looked normal again, and the only evidence that anything had happened was a faint residual shimmer at the point where the tear had been, and the silence on the frequencies where 3 ships had been transmitting moments before. Grace turned to me. There were tears on her face, which was the first time I had ever seen her cry. "Get me the names," she said. "All of them." I read the crew manifests of the 3 lost ships aloud on the bridge of the Perseverance, and my voice broke on the 7th name, and did not fully recover for the rest of the list. There were 41 names in total. Humans and Sarathi and 1 Kethari engineer who had volunteered for a core placement crew because she said she wanted to test her gravitational energy harvesting concept under extreme conditions and might never get another chance. Her name was Kessa, the young Velthrani defector who had joined us because her academy would not let her ask the questions she needed to ask. She had found her answers in a place where the questions were the most dangerous they could possibly be. 41 people. They did not die to prove a point. They did not die to show the concordance that humanity was worthy. They did not die for revenge, or for pride, or for any of the reasons that the old galaxy's stories said people should die for. They died because people were in danger, and they could help. And when the call went out for volunteers, they raised their hands. That was it. That was the whole reason. And that was humanity, right there, in its simplest and most essential form. Not the species that was too primitive for the concordance. Not the species that was biologically unstable or culturally incoherent. Just the species that showed up when things went wrong and did what needed to be done, and sometimes did not come back. I recorded 41 names, and the galaxy listened, and nobody, not even the Velthrani, had anything to say except thank you. 2 years after the rupture, I received an invitation that I had stopped expecting. The Grand Conclave of the Galactic Concordance requested the presence of a Terran delegation at HFY for a formal session of address. The invitation was signed by the speaker of the conclave, and for the first time in Concordance history, the speaker was a Kethari. Sarah had been elected to the position 6 months earlier, in a vote that would have been unthinkable a decade ago. The founding species had always held the speakership. The fact that a Kethari now occupied it told me everything I needed to know about how much the Concordance had changed since a tear in the sky had forced it to confront the limits of its own certainty. Helen Cross asked me to lead the delegation. I almost said no. I had spent 14 years building a life in the Void March, and the thought of returning to that chamber, standing at that podium, facing those floating platforms filled with the representatives of species that had once judged humanity unworthy, filled me with a weariness that went deeper than fatigue. It was not anger. I had stopped being angry a long time ago. It was something closer to the feeling you get when someone who hurt you years ago wants to have a conversation about it, and you have already processed it and moved on and built a good life, and the conversation feels less like resolution and more like being asked to revisit a room you have already left. Helen understood. She did not push, but she said something that changed my mind. "You do not owe them anything," she said, "but the young man who stood at that podium 14 years ago deserves to see how the story ends." I thought about that young man. I thought about his rehearsed speech and his numb hands, and the way he walked out of the chamber without thanking anyone. I thought about how much he had changed, and how much he had not, and I agreed to go. The delegation was small by design. Myself, Lucy Grant, Simon Blake, and 3 Compact Council representatives, a Sarathi philosopher named Thoasine, the Kethari diplomat who had brokered the friendship treaty, and a Toraneth scholar, whose songs contained more diplomatic nuance than any speech I could write. We traveled to HFY aboard a compact diplomatic vessel, a biome hull ship that was sleeker and more advanced than anything the station's docking systems had been designed to accommodate. The dock operators had to improvise, which struck me as an appropriate metaphor for everything that had happened between us and the Concordance. HFY looked the same. That surprised me, though it should not have. The station was ancient, and ancient things do not change on human timescales. The corridors still hummed. The twin-colored light still shifted across the walls. The floating platforms still rose in tiers toward a ceiling that vanished into blue. But the atmosphere was different. The last time I had walked these corridors, the diplomats in them had been watching us with the casual interest of spectators, observing a species that did not matter. Now they watched us with something else. I recognized it because I had seen it before, on the faces of the Sarathi elders the first time a human ship descended through their atmosphere. It was not fear. It was not hostility. It was a recalibration, the visible process of adjusting an understanding of reality to accommodate new information. They were looking at us and revising their assumptions in real time, and the revision was not comfortable. The chamber was full, not just full in the way it had been during the rejection vote, when the seats were occupied by delegates performing a routine function. Full in the way that a room is full when something historic is about to happen and everyone knows it, and no one wants to miss it. The upper tiers were packed with observers and media representatives from species I had never seen before. The atmospheric bubbles were fully activated, accommodating delegates from environments as different as vacuum and high-pressure methane. Sarah stood at the speaker's position, and seeing her there, in the place that had always been occupied by a founding species drone or elder, made something in my chest tighten. She had risked everything by giving me that data chip. She had believed in humanity when believing in humanity was a political liability, and now she stood at the highest position in the galaxy's oldest parliament, and she was about to preside over something the Concordance had never done before. The formal apology lasted 27 minutes. It was delivered by a panel of senior delegates representing the Concordance's governing council, and it was the most thorough, specific, and unflinching act of institutional self-examination I had ever witnessed. They named the rejection vote. They called it a mistake. They identified the Velthrani Strategic Forecasting Bureau's risk assessment as the actual motivation. They acknowledged that the stated grounds, biological instability, cultural incoherence, technological prematurity, diplomatic volatility, had been pretexts designed to disguise a political decision driven by fear of human potential. They apologized for the 40 years of diplomatic effort that had been wasted. They apologized for the species in the Void March that had been left in isolation because the Concordance had chosen not to explore the region. They apologized for the lives lost during the rupture evacuation, lives that might not have been lost if humanity had been a member of the Concordance with full access to its resources and intelligence networks. The Velthrani delegation sat through the apology in silence. The elders, the old guard who had orchestrated the rejection, did not move. Their compound eyes were fixed forward, their bodies perfectly still. But around them, on the surrounding platforms, younger Velthrani delegates did something I had never seen members of that species do in a formal setting. They stood. One by one, they rose from their seats and remained standing for the duration of the apology. It was a Velthrani gesture that I later learned signified agreement with a statement that one's elders had opposed. It was an act of quiet rebellion, performed in the most public setting imaginable, by members of the galaxy's oldest civilization against the traditions of their own governing class. When the apology concluded, Sarah turned to me and said, "The delegation from the Terran Open Compact is invited to address the chamber." I stood up. I walked to the podium. It was the same podium. The cold, not glass, not crystal surface under my fingers was exactly as I remembered it. The chamber stretched out before me, tier after tier of alien faces, thousands of eyes and optical sensors and sensory organs I did not have names for, all focused on the human standing, where a human had stood 14 years ago, and been told he was not welcome. I had written a speech. I had spent 3 days on it, refining every word, calibrating every sentence for diplomatic precision and emotional resonance. I had practiced it in my quarters, and timed it and tested it against the translation matrix to ensure it would render accurately in every linguistic format the chamber required. I did not use the speech. Standing at the podium, looking out at the chamber, I set the prepared text aside and spoke from a place that was deeper and more honest than anything I could have written in advance. "Thank you," I said. "The apology we have just heard was brave and specific and true, and I want to acknowledge the courage it took to deliver it. Institutional self-criticism is one of the hardest things any organization can do, and the Concordance has done it with a thoroughness that commands respect." I paused. The translation matrix hummed as my words rippled outward through 16,000 linguistic formats. "You have offered us full membership in the Concordance, retroactive recognition of our species' contributions, a permanent seat on the Security Conclave, lane travel access, technology exchanges, reparations. By any measure, you have offered us everything we originally asked for, and more." Another pause. I could feel the chamber leaning forward, thousands of beings waiting for the acceptance, for the moment when humanity would finally take its rightful place in the galactic order. We respectfully decline. The silence that followed was the loudest sound I have ever heard. It was not the silence of shock, though shock was part of it. It was the silence of a galaxy recalculating, the moment when 4,000 civilizations simultaneously realized that their fundamental assumption about what humanity wanted had been wrong. "The Terran Open Compact is not a consolation prize," I said, and my voice was steady because I meant every word with every part of myself. "It is a home. 31 species built it together, from nothing, in a region of space that everyone else had given up on. We built it without permission, without assistance, and without the expectation that anyone would ever approve of what we were doing. We built it because building things together is what we do. It is what humans have always done, and it is what the species who chose to join us have always done. And the thing we built is not something we are willing to subordinate to an institution that told us we were not welcome." I saw Sarah's eyes widen slightly. I saw the Velthrani elders go absolutely rigid. I saw the younger Velthrani who had stood during the apology exchange glances with each other, and I could not tell whether their expressions held dismay or something closer to admiration. Joining the concordance would mean adopting lane travel when our fold-step drives go further and faster. It would mean connecting to the resonance grid when our daemon network is open and free. It would mean entering a hierarchy when we have built a partnership. It would mean telling the 30 species who trusted us, who left their old lives behind and built something new with us in the Void March, that the alliance we created together was just a waiting room for the real institution. I shook my head. We will not do that. They deserve better. We all deserve better. I let the words settle. Then I continued. But I did not come here to close a door. Humanity has never been interested in closing doors. We came here to open one. I outlined the counteroffer that Helen and I had developed over weeks of careful discussion with the Compact Council. The Concordance was welcome to join the Compact's open trade framework. Any concordant species could establish direct diplomatic and commercial relations with the Compact without preconditions. Technology sharing would be mutual and voluntary. Fold-step drive specifications, daemon network relay designs, cascade reactor blueprints, all of it would be available to any species that wanted it, without licensing fees, without access restrictions, without the bureaucratic gatekeeping that had defined the Concordance's approach to knowledge for 10,000 years. You offered us a seat at your table, I said. We have built our own table, and there is room at ours for anyone who wants to sit down. We are not shunning you. That was never who we were. The door is open. It always was. I stepped away from the podium. The chamber remained silent for 5 seconds. Then the Kethari delegation stood and signaled formal acceptance of the counteroffer. 12 other species followed within the hour. By the end of the day, preliminary trade and cooperation agreements had been initiated with 37 Concordance member species, more diplomatic progress than the entire 40-year membership campaign had achieved. The Velthrani said nothing. Their elders left the chamber in a formation so rigid and precise that it looked choreographed. The younger delegates stayed behind, and several of them approached our delegation afterward with expressions that mixed embarrassment, hope, and something that I chose to interpret as the beginning of understanding. Thesson was among them. The young Velthrani who had told me the truth about the rejection vote stood at the edge of our group, her compound eyes shifting through patterns I had learned to read over our months of secret communication. She did not speak to me directly. She did not need to. She simply stood where I could see her, and let her presence say what words could not. She had risked her career, her standing within her clan, and her safety by communicating with me. She had done it because she believed the truth was more important than tradition. And now she was standing in a room where the truth had been spoken aloud, in front of the entire galaxy, and the sky had not fallen. I made a point of walking over to her before we left. Thank you, I said, for telling me about the Forecasting Bureau. It mattered. Her eyes shifted to a pattern I had not seen before. I expected you to use the information as a weapon, she said, to embarrass the elders publicly. That was never the plan. I know that now. Your species does not weaponize truth. You just share it and let people decide what to do with it. Most of the time, I said, because honesty seemed appropriate. She made a sound that the translation matrix rendered as a laugh, though I suspect the original was more complex. Most of the time is enough, she said. Lucy walked beside me as we left the chamber for the second time. That was not what they expected, she said. No, I agreed. They expected us to take the win. Was it not a win? I thought about it. It was something better than a win. A win means someone else loses. What we offered was an invitation. Nobody has to lose anything. Do you think they will accept? Some of them already have. The rest will take longer. But the door is open, and doors that are open tend to get walked through eventually. That is just how doors work. 20 years. That is how long it took for the galaxy to become something new. I am sitting in a cafe on Aethys Yun as I write this. It is not a cafe that existed the last time I was here. It was built 3 years ago by a Sarathi human cooperative that wanted to create a space where species from different atmospheric requirements could share a meal in visual proximity. The cafe is divided into transparent sections, each with its own atmosphere, temperature, and gravity, and the sections are arranged in a circle around a central garden that grows plants from 40 different worlds under a lighting system that cycles through the spectral preferences of every species that might walk through the door. The menu offers dishes from 217 culinary traditions, including 14 that did not exist before the compact, brought together species whose cooking philosophies turned out to be complementary in ways nobody had predicted. I come here most mornings when I am on the station. I order coffee, which is one of Earth's most successful cultural exports, and is now consumed by at least 30 alien species that have no biological need for caffeine, but have developed a deep appreciation for the ritual of sitting quietly, with a warm cup, and watching the universe go by. The Toraneth sing while they drink their coffee. The Surathi change color. The Kethari hold their cups with both hands and close their silver eyes. It is a small thing, coffee, but small things are how civilizations get to know each other. I am 61 years old. My hair is more gray than brown. My knees protest when I stand too quickly. I retired from the Compact's diplomatic service 4 years ago, and I have spent the time since then writing a memoir that keeps getting longer because history keeps happening, and I keep being asked to comment on it. People call me an ambassador, which is technically incorrect since I no longer hold any official position. People call me a hero, which makes me uncomfortable, because the actual heroes are the ones whose names I read on the bridge of the Perseverance, and whose voices I will never hear again. People call me the man who turned down the galaxy, which is the most inaccurate description of all, because I did not turn down anything. I just offered something better. I tried to explain this to a journalist last month, a young woman from a news service that broadcasts to over 100 worlds. She had asked me the question that every journalist asks, which is whether I regret the rejection vote. I told her what I tell everyone. The rejection was not a wound. It was a door closing, and when a door closes, you have two choices. You can stand in front of it and cry, or you can turn around and see what else is in the room. We turned around, and we found that the room was a lot bigger than we thought, and it was full of interesting people who were happy to see us. She asked whether humanity had forgiven the concordance. I thought about it for a long time before answering. Forgiveness implies that a wrong was done and that the injured party has chosen to let go of the injury. But I am not sure the concordance wronged us in the way that the word implies. They made a decision based on fear, and fear is not a moral failing. It is a survival response. Every species feels it. Every species has made decisions based on it. The concordance looked at humanity and saw something they could not predict or control, and they responded by shutting the door. It was not brave, it was not wise, but it was understandable, and understanding is the foundation that forgiveness is built on. The galaxy has changed, not in the dramatic, overnight way that stories usually describe, but in the slow, deep, irreversible way that actual change happens. The concordance still exists. The Grand Conclave still meets in its tiered chamber, with its floating platforms and its atmospheric bubbles. The Velthrani are still the oldest species in known space, and their elders still carry themselves with the rigid dignity of beings who remember when the galaxy was young. But the concordance is not what it was. Its membership has stabilized at around 3,000 species, down from the 4,400 who were present the day of the rejection vote. The species that left did not disappear. They joined the compact, or established independent relationships with both organizations, or formed smaller alliances of their own. The galaxy is no longer a single political entity with a single hierarchy. It is a network of networks, a web of relationships that is more complex, more dynamic, and more resilient than anything the founding species designed. Lane travel and fold-step drives coexist. Some species prefer the lanes for their reliability and predictability. Others prefer fold-step for its range and flexibility. Many ships carry both systems and switch between them depending on the journey. The lane network is still maintained by the Velthrani, but the access fees have been reduced to a fraction of their former level, because the existence of a free alternative makes monopoly pricing unsustainable. The fold-step drive specifications were published openly by the Compact, available to any species that wanted them, and the resulting proliferation of independent space travel has transformed the galaxy's economic geography. Systems that were once isolated by their distance from the nearest lane corridor are now accessible by fold-step, and the new trade routes that have opened up as a result have created prosperity in regions that the Concordance's infrastructure had bypassed for millennia. The resonance grid and the Damon network are interlinked. A protocol developed by a joint team of Rushan mathematicians and human programmers allows seamless communication between the two systems, and the combined network covers more of the galaxy than either one did alone. The Rushan, who spent centuries as the Concordance's most methodical and data-driven members, have become enthusiastic participants in the Compact's open research initiatives. Their probability models, once confounded by human unpredictability, have been recalibrated to account for what the Shun now call creative variance, a factor that makes predictions less precise but more interesting. I had dinner with a Shun delegation last month, which is an unusual experience because the Shun do not eat in the biological sense, but they have developed a social ritual around observing other species eat that they find deeply informative. The lead Shun researcher told me, through the translation matrix's careful rendering of mathematical harmonics into human language, that studying human behavior had fundamentally changed the Shun understanding of probability. Before us, they had assumed that all intelligent behavior converged toward optimal solutions given sufficient time. Humanity had demonstrated that intelligence could deliberately choose suboptimal paths for reasons that were not captured by efficiency models. Reasons like beauty, loyalty, stubbornness, love, and the sheer pleasure of doing something that nobody expected. The Shun found this baffling and wonderful in equal measure. The Dravine, who had spent the entirety of my diplomatic career treating carbon-based life as a temporary inconvenience, have undergone perhaps the most surprising transformation of all. The Dravine are silicon-based, ancient, patient, and until recently, profoundly uninterested in any species whose biology they considered ephemeral. But the cascade reactor technology caught their attention. Silicon-based life has enormous energy requirements, and the Dravine had spent millennia struggling with the limitations of stellar fusion to power their massive civilization. The cascade reactors, with their effectively unlimited energy output, represented a solution to a problem the Dravine had assumed was unsolvable. A Dravine delegation visited Threshold 1 last year and spent 3 weeks studying the reactor specifications with an intensity that bordered on reverence. When they departed, the senior Dravine delegate, a being so old that its crystalline structure had begun to develop internal light patterns from centuries of accumulated electromagnetic charge, made a statement that has since become one of the most quoted passages in galactic diplomatic history. It said, "We spent 10,000 years believing that temporary things could not produce permanent value. The carbon beings have shown us that impermanence is not a limitation. It is fuel. The Void March is no longer a frontier. It is a region, the same as any other, populated by species that are known and mapped and connected to the rest of galactic civilization. The Surathi have become renowned across the galaxy for their philosophy and their poetry. Their works, translated into thousands of languages, are studied in universities, on worlds that had never heard of them 20 years ago. The Surathi elder who reached out her hand to me in a clearing on her homeworld has become one of the most quoted thinkers in galactic intellectual history. She once told me that the most important moment in her species' existence was not when we arrived, but when her people realized that arrival did not mean conquest, that the strangers from the lights had come not to take, but to share. The Taurineth, the avian species whose songs carried mathematical information, have revolutionized data transmission across the galaxy. Their harmonic encoding techniques, adapted for electronic communication, allow the transmission of complex information at densities that neither the resonance grid nor the Damon network could achieve alone. A Taurineth communications engineer won the first ever joint Concordance Compact Science Prize last year, and her acceptance speech, delivered in song, lasted 40 minutes and contained a complete mathematical proof embedded in its melodic structure. The Paloon, the subterranean sonar navigators, have become the galaxy's foremost architects. Their understanding of acoustic space, combined with human computational design tools and Kethari material science, has produced buildings on 100 worlds that are not just structures but experiences, spaces that shape sound and light and movement in ways that make the people inside them feel things they did not know they could feel. I visited a Paloon-designed concert hall on a station in the Outer Compact last year, and I sat in a seat that had been shaped to the precise acoustic profile of a human ear, and the music that filled the space was so perfectly rendered that I wept without knowing why. Humanity is everywhere, not in the way that empires spread, with flags and borders and the implicit threat of force. In the way that ideas spread, by being useful, by being interesting, by being the kind of thing that makes people say, "I had not thought of that," and then spend the rest of the day thinking about it. Human music plays in cantinas and concert halls across the galaxy. Human cuisine has been adapted, modified, and remixed by species with sensory palates that range from the olfactory to the electromagnetic. Human literature has been translated into languages that do not have words for some of the emotions our stories describe, and the translators have invented new words for those emotions, and those new words have entered the vocabularies of species that did not know they needed them until they read a human story and felt something they could not name. I walked the corridors of HFY yesterday, the same corridors I walked 20 years ago on the night of the rejection vote. The walls still hummed. The twin-colored lights still shifted across the floor. But the corridors were different, because the people in them were different. A Surathi diplomat walked beside a Velthrani engineer, their conversation animated and clearly technical, their body language suggesting the comfortable familiarity of colleagues who had worked together long enough to develop shared shorthand. A group of Toraneth students perched on a railing, singing softly, their songs attracting a small audience of species from half a dozen worlds. A human child, maybe 7 years old, ran past me chasing a small floating drone that was clearly a toy, and she nearly collided with a Dravine official who was approximately 15 times her size, and the Dravine stopped, and the child looked up with an expression of pure delight at the enormous silicon being towering over her, and the Dravine made a sound that the translation matrix rendered as, "Careful, little carbon." There is a mural on the main concourse of HFY. It was painted 2 years ago by a collective of artists from 9 species, and it depicts the rupture evacuation. The mural stretches for 100 meters along the concourse wall, and it shows ships from every species that participated in the rescue, rendered in styles that blend the artistic traditions of a dozen different cultures. At the center of the mural, surrounded by the chaos of the rupture and the orderly lines of evacuating vessels, there is a simple image of 2 hands clasping. One hand has 5 fingers and is clearly human. The other has 6 fingers and is clearly Surathi. Below the clasped hands, in script that the translation matrix renders into every language simultaneously, are 3 words: "We came." A young Velthrani student recognized me near the mural yesterday. She was carrying a tablet and a bag of books, and she looked at me with the wide, compound eyes of someone who had grown up hearing about the rejection vote the way I had grown up hearing about historical events that happened before I was born, as stories that shaped the world but that belonged to a time she could not quite imagine. "You are Daniel Ward," she said. "I am. Would you sign my copy of your book?" I signed it. I am not good at signing books. My handwriting is poor, and I never know what to write besides my name. I wrote, "The door is always open." She read it, and her eyes shifted pattern in a way that I think meant she was pleased. I walked on, past the mural, past the cafe, past the council chambers and the diplomatic suites and the observation decks, until I reached a small room near the docking port on the station's outer ring. The room was a museum now, a tiny museum, barely large enough for 20 visitors, dedicated to the Terran diplomatic mission that had occupied these quarters 20 years ago. The displays were modest: a photograph of the original delegation, a copy of the formal rejection notice, a reproduction of the podium where I had stood, and, mounted in a small case near the entrance, an actual artifact, the data chip that Sarah had pressed into my hand on the day we left. I stood in front of the data chip for a long time. I thought about Sarah handing it to me in the corridor, her silver eyes full of a faith I had not yet earned. I thought about Catherine Moore's 5-word message. I thought about Helen Cross pacing in her office in Geneva, explaining threshold with the contained excitement of a woman who could see the future and was impatient for the present to catch up. I thought about Simon Blake and his napkin and his origami and his cascade reactors. I thought about Grace Elliott's tears on the bridge. I thought about Kessa, who left her homeworld to ask the questions her academy would not allow, and who found her answers in the heart of a wound in the sky. I thought about Lucy Grant offering tea to a surveillance drone. I thought about the Surathi elder's hand on mine, cool and smooth, the first handshake between 2 species that chose each other. I thought about what humanity did with a closed door. We opened a window. We climbed through it. We found a garden that nobody else had bothered to visit, and then we invited the whole neighborhood over. In the evening, I went back to the main concourse and sat on a bench near the observation windows. The stars beyond the glass were the same stars that had been there 20 years ago, and 20,000 years ago, and would be there long after the Concordance and the Compact and humanity itself had become history. A Velthrani elder sat down on the bench beside me. She was very old, older than any Velthrani I had met. Her carapace worn smooth by decades and her compound eyes dimmed to a soft amber. I did not recognize her at first. Then I did. She was one of the elders who had voted against Earth, one of the original architects of the rejection. We sat in silence for a while. The stars turned slowly beyond the glass. "I was afraid of your species," she said. Her voice through the translation matrix was thin and careful, like something that might break if handled too roughly. "Why?" I asked, though I already knew. "Because you do not wait for permission to hope." I let that settle into the space between us. Outside the window, a ship that was half biome hull and half conventional alloy glided past, a hybrid vessel from one of the new cooperative shipyards, crewed by members of 5 different species, heading toward a destination that no single civilization could have reached alone. "Is that so frightening?" I asked. The elder considered the question for a long time. "It was," she said finally. "It was the most frightening thing in the galaxy. A species that simply decides to build a future without waiting for anyone to tell them they are allowed. We had spent 10,000 years building systems of control, systems of permission, systems of hierarchy, and then your species arrived and walked straight through all of it as if it were not there. Not because you were stronger, not because you were more advanced, because it did not occur to you that the systems applied to you." "They did not," I said. "We applied to your system once, and it said no, so we built our own." "Yes, and your system had no gates. No barriers. No application process. Just an open door." She made a sound that the translation matrix did not render, something between a sigh and a harmonic that resonated in frequencies below human hearing. "I spent my career maintaining gates," she said. "I believed the gates were necessary. I believed that without them, the galaxy would descend into chaos. That uncontrolled contact between species would produce conflict, exploitation, collapse. And instead," she gestured toward the window, toward the hybrid ship now disappearing into the starfield, "and instead, you produced a galaxy that is more creative, more connected, and more alive than anything my generation imagined possible. And you did it by refusing to be afraid." We sat together until the station's light cycle shifted toward evening, and the twin-colored light faded to a soft purple, and the stars outside the window seemed to brighten as the interior lights dimmed. It was the most honest conversation I had ever had with a being from another species, and it happened on a bench, without ceremony, without an audience, between 2 old people who had been on opposite sides of a decision that had shaped the galaxy, and who had both lived long enough to see where that decision led. People ask me if I am bitter about the vote. I tell them the truth. It was the best thing that ever happened to us, not because the rejection made us stronger, we were always strong, but because it made us stop looking for someone else's approval and start building something worthy of our own. The galaxy chose to shun Earth. And we walked away smiling. Not because we did not care. We cared deeply. We cared about the species in the Void March, who had never been visited. We cared about the resources that had never been found. We cared about the futures that had never been imagined, because the old galaxy was too comfortable to imagine them. We cared so much that we built a new path to all of it, without permission, without resentment, without looking back. The future is not something you are given permission to enter. You build it, you share it, you leave the door open behind you, and eventually, everyone walks through.